7 Mindset Rules That Shape Success. There's a specific moment most people have had, usually somewhere quiet, maybe late at night or early in the morning, where something clicks. Not dramatically, not like a light bulb, more like a slow exhale. A realization that the way you have been thinking about a problem, about your life, about what is possible for you, was never quite accurate. And in that moment, something shifts. Not everything, just enough. If you have ever had that feeling, even once, then what I'm about to share is going to make a lot of sense to you. Because there's a certain kind of person who moves through the world differently, not louder, not faster, not necessarily more confident, just oriented differently. Like they're playing by a slightly different set of internal rules that nobody handed them, rules they arrived at slowly, through observation and failure, and a willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to understand it. Most people around them do not fully understand them. They get called intense sometimes, or too serious, or they get told they think too much. What the people saying that do not realize is that the thinking is not the problem. It never was. It was always the thing pointing the way forward. What we're really talking about here is not a set of productivity tips or motivational reminders. Those things are everywhere and they tend to fade by Thursday. What we're talking about is something older and quieter and far more durable. We're talking about the internal architecture of how certain people approach their lives, the specific mindset patterns that, when they are operating underneath the surface, change everything else by default. There is more going on here than most people realize, and it begins not with ambition, but with perception. The first pattern is this: the people who tend to build something meaningful over time see effort not as a signal of struggle, but as a signal of growth. This sounds simple until you understand what is actually happening in the brain when we do something difficult. Neuroscience has shown us that the moment a neural pathway is strained, it begins to strengthen. The discomfort you feel when something is hard is not evidence that you are failing at it. It is evidence that your brain is physically reorganizing itself to do that thing better. People who intuitively understand this, whether or not they have ever read a neuroscience paper, treat friction differently. They do not interpret a hard day as a sign they chose wrong. They interpret it as a sign they are in the right place. The second pattern is closely related, and it has to do with how a person responds to being wrong. There is a well-documented psychological split between people who treat their beliefs as part of their identity and people who treat their beliefs as hypotheses. When someone holds a belief the way they hold their name, being wrong about it feels like an attack on who they are. But when a belief is held more lightly, as a working theory about how the world operates, being corrected does not feel threatening. It feels useful. The people who build real competence over time tend to have developed this second relationship with being wrong, not because they are more humble by nature, but because at some point in their lives, something important fell apart, and they learned that surviving the update felt better than defending the illusion. The third pattern is about where attention goes. Research on attention tells us that we are not passive receivers of experience, we are active editors of it. The brain filters out an enormous amount of what is happening around us at any given moment, and what gets through depends heavily on what we have already trained ourselves to notice. People who consistently identify opportunities are not luckier than other people. They have simply trained their attention, usually without realizing it, toward possibility rather than threat. This shift did not happen overnight. In most cases, it was a slow neurological retraining built from small, repeated choices over many years. It's worth pausing here to say something clearly. None of this is about being better than anyone else. A mind oriented toward threat is not a broken mind. In many environments, that orientation is not just useful, it's necessary. The nervous system adapts to context. A person who grew up in an unpredictable environment learned to scan for danger, because scanning for danger kept them safe. There is no judgment in that. There is only the recognition that what protected you once may be limiting you now, and that recognition itself is a form of power. The fourth pattern has a counterintuitive quality that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. It is this: the people who make the most progress are often the ones who are most comfortable with slow, not passive, not careless, but genuinely unbothered by the pace of things. And the reason this works comes down to compounding, which is one of those concepts that sounds purely financial until you realize it applies to almost every human endeavor. Small, consistent inputs, repeated over long enough windows of time, produce outcomes that look sudden to everyone watching from the outside. The people inside the process know it was never sudden. They were just doing the next right thing, again and again, without needing the result to arrive on a particular schedule. The sixth pattern is about identity, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting. There is a significant difference between a person who is trying to do something and a person who has decided they are someone who does that thing. Psychologist James Clear, drawing on earlier identity theory, has written about this distinction in a way that resonates with something most people feel instinctively. When behavior is attached to identity rather than outcome, it becomes self-reinforcing. You don't need external motivation to maintain something when it is simply an expression of who you are. The shift from doing to being is not semantic, it is structural. And for most people, it happened not through an announcement, but through a quiet decision they made on a day they can barely remember. The sixth pattern is about discomfort, and specifically about the relationship a person develops with the edge of their capability. There is a space that performance psychologists sometimes refer to as the productive zone of disequilibrium. It's the territory just beyond what feels easy, where things are difficult enough to require full engagement, but not so overwhelming that the system shuts down. People who grow consistently have usually found a way to live in that zone without fleeing from it. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because they have learned to distinguish between discomfort that means stop and discomfort that means continue. That distinction is not innate, it's learned, usually by pushing through something once and surviving it. The seventh pattern might be the most quietly important of all. These people have generally made peace with the fact that most of the journey will be invisible. The internal work, the slow recalibration of beliefs, the boring repetition of small habits, the private conversations a person has with themselves about what they actually want and what they are actually afraid of, none of that is visible to anyone else. And the people who sustain real momentum over a lifetime have stopped needing it to be. They have found a way to derive meaning from the process itself, not just from the moments when the process produces something the world can see. That's not a small thing. For most people, the hunger for external validation is so deeply wired that resisting it requires real, ongoing practice. Here's what I want you to sit with. Nothing in what I just described requires you to be a different kind of person than you already are. These patterns are not traits you either have or lack. They are orientations that develop. They deepen with practice, with reflection, with experience. And the fact that you were drawn to something like this, that you found yourself here, paying attention, suggests you are already moving in this direction without necessarily having a name for it yet. The way you have been thinking, even the parts of it that you have judged as flaws, or slowness, or overthinking, is not working against you. Most of it is working for you in ways you haven't fully accounted for yet. If something in this felt recognizable, there is more to explore. There is a pattern underneath all of these patterns, something about the way certain people relate to uncertainty that shapes everything else at a level most frameworks never touch. That one is worth its own conversation.